You stand on a ridge where the sky is a clean, merciless blue and the wind carries the smell of sage and cold stone. In your mind you have the tidy map of American history, Lewis and Clark, frontier forts, homesteads carved out of prairie. But the land under your boots hums with a different memory, older and stranger than the textbooks. That expectation, that the past here is only the familiar sweep of settlers, the gold rush, ranching families, meets something that refuses to fit, carved stones that predate the map, earthworks whose geometry leaves archaeologists scratching their heads, and stories whispered by small-town residents about bones bigger than any human skeleton, or a ring of stones that seems to hum on a certain night. We are going to walk those ridges and valley floors together. We are going to follow the evidence and the rumor, the reliable field notes, and the feverish testimony, and we are going to keep our feet in two worlds at once, the cautious world of science and the fertile world of wonder, because in Montana, as in any place with a long human story, the line between them is thin. From the moment the first explorers crossed the Rockies, Montana has been described as big and empty, a wilderness whose silence masks the past. But empty landscapes often hide things, strata of occupation, trade routes etched into the bones of rivers, and artifacts that refuse to sit neatly inside the margins of a single explanation. Picture the Bitterroot at dawn, fog slithering along the water, cottonwoods clinking like old chimes, and imagine an excavation team unrolling a tarp to reveal not just arrowheads and pottery but geometric cut stone, worked with a precision that seems out of place for the supposed era of occupation. Or picture a dusty small-town bar where an elderly rancher leans in to tell you about the night his son found a burial chamber with skeletons so large that the ribs span like wagon wheels. When you listen, these stories push against your idea of what Montana was, of who passed through these valleys and why. This is a story about the places where evidence and myth cross, where a careful ledger of dates meets folklore, and where the questions the land asks are still louder than the answers we can give. Throughout this script I will speak to you directly, because this is a place you can walk into in your mind, and I will do it with the same balanced voice I'd use standing in a field with a shovel and a clipboard, or sitting across from a town diner table with a coffee cup between us. I will offer you dates and cultures when we have them, pollen cores, radiocarbon ranges, artifact typologies, and I will also tell you the tales that have kept certain sites alive in local memory. We will look at trade routes that stretch farther than they ought to, and at objects that have turned up in contexts that don't fit our tidy models. We will admit uncertainty often, there is no virtue in hiding it, and where science offers competing theories we will set them side by side so you can see the reasoning, the leaps, and the gaps. The first mystery we encounter is one of those places that reads like a field note and a folktale braided together, a ring of carved stones on a plateau, the stones placed with apparent intention, their faces etched with shapes that recur nowhere else in the region. The one-sentence teaser is simple. Atop a windswept plateau near the Missouri River, a ring of work stone insists it is older and stranger than anyone expected. Archaeologists have dated surrounding charcoal to a range that puts human presence at least several thousand years ago, and the stones, granite boulders shaped and placed with regularity, sit in a geometry that suggests knowledge of astronomy. Historical context places this site in the middle of the northern plains, a crossroads for tribes who traded bison hides, obsidian, and stories along river corridors. Measurements taken by survey teams note that the stone's circle's diameter is roughly 37 meters, and that certain stones align to the sunrise on the summer solstice within a margin of error that is, frankly, uncanny. Key discoveries at the site include fragments of pottery with temper consistent with many plains cultures but stylistically ambiguous, flakes of obsidian that trace back, via geochemical sourcing, to quarries hundreds of miles to the west, and a few worked bone tools that show signs of extended use. Taken together, these finds suggest sustained human activity and long-distance exchange. But here's where it gets tricky: the stone techniques, pecking and smoothing with tool marks and straight, parallel lines, look more like methods used in regions to the south and west. How did a people here, in this pocket of the northern plains, develop or adopt such methods? One theory suggests a convergence. Similar problems, similar solutions, independent invention. Another proposes contact. Perhaps traders or small exploratory groups from distant cultures visited and brought techniques with them. A third, more controversial idea argues for an earlier, more complex regional tradition of megalithic arrangement, one that our current models of population density and mobility do not comfortably allow. Still, for all the evidence, we still don't know whether the circle was a communal calendar, a boundary marker, a ritual stage, or something else entirely. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, the low sun striking the high faces and casting long, precise shadows. Does it feel like someone who understood the sky stood here, or like chance and later interpretation made patterns where none were intended? The question is not merely technical, it pulls on how we imagine ancient communities and the sophistication of their spatial knowledge. Move south now, into the shadow of sandstone cliffs where petroglyph panels cluster like a gallery of an unknown people's intentions. One line, sharp and repeated, looks almost like a map, winding lines that could be rivers, a series of dots that could be camps, and there, among the familiar bison and human motifs, another figure, a massive, elongated humanoid whose proportions strain the geometry of a normal human body. It is uncanny enough that every visitor photographs it, and every local adolescent spins stories until the figure grows into a giant in their telling. The teaser here, along a canyon wall, a repertoire of petroglyphs includes figures that refuse to be reduced to simple hunting scenes. The historical context: rock art along Montana's sandstone cliffs dates across epochs. Some panels patinate darkly and are likely thousands of years old, while others look fresher. Measuring the patina, examining lichen growth, and comparing peck depth yields a relative chronology, but absolute dates remain hard to pin down. The cultural context is complicated. The bands and tribes who used this region shifted over centuries: Sioux, Salish, Crow, and each group's relationship to rock art varied. Key data includes the distribution of non-local pigments in an associated cave, pollen trapped in sheltered alcoves, and the location of certain motifs clustered near natural springs. One hypothesis reads the elongated humanoid as a symbolic being, an ancestral spirit, a mythic giant, or a composite hybrid. Another claims it could represent a stylized warrior wearing ritual accoutrements elongated by ceremonial dress. Yet another, the most sensational, ponders contact with unusually tall individuals or even an imported image from outside groups with different aesthetic conventions. For scholars, the proper approach is cautious. Iconography is slippery, and imposing modern preconceptions risks misreading symbolic language. Still, for all the careful cataloging and debate, we still don't know whether the elongated figure is myth, exaggerated memory, or evidence of something more literal. Picture yourself tracing the grooves with a gloved finger, the canyon's quiet pressing in. The petroglyph stares back through millennia and asks you what you will do with the ambiguity. Further inland, hidden beside a now dry coulee, earthworks emerge in crop marks seen from satellite images, rings and rectilinear impressions that could be simple field boundaries, or they could be buried structures. The teaser, beneath the prairie's thin soil, aerial photographs reveal geometric anomalies that imply deliberate, large-scale engineering. Historical context: surveys suggest these anomalies correspond to soil disturbances inconsistent with agricultural use, and test pits have uncovered post holes and compacted clay layers indicative of habitation or construction. The dates are tricky. Radiocarbon samples from charred wood in one test pit returned calibrated ages spanning multiple centuries, suggesting either repeated use or contamination. The artifacts include fragments of woven fabric preserved in anaerobic pockets, beads of freshwater shell traded from distant rivers, and a concentration of hammerstones organized in a way that implies communal manufacturing rather than casual use. Competing theories here are rich and messy. One line of thinking suggests these were seasonal aggregations, places where bands gathered to process bison, exchange goods, and perform ritual. Another argues for permanent, sedentary communities practicing a form of agriculture we have not fully appreciated in the northern plains, possibly explaining the scale and geometry of the earthworks. A more radical view posits ceremonial landscapes designed to embody cosmological principles, with size and orientation reflecting myths rather than pragmatic needs. Yet, for all the soil stratigraphy and bead sourcing, we still don't know whether these geometric anomalies mark homes, temples, or something else entirely. Imagine yourself flying overhead in a ghost plane, the late summer fields mottled in green and gold, and try to read the hidden lines. Do they narrate everyday life or ritualized choreography? There are places where the ground yields not just structures but bones, large, anomalous bones whose measurements do not fit ordinary human osteology. The one-sentence teaser: on a ranch outside a small town, a plow turned up a burial with skeletal elements far beyond expected human dimensions. The historical context comes from oral testimony. The family remembers their grandfather mentioning bones as big as a steer, found while breaking sod in the 1930s. The bones were photographed, sketches made, and then slowly, mysteriously, vanished into a drawer where legend sits. The later discovery involved a more scientific approach, a partial femur, recorded by a small-town museum in the 1970s, measured at lengths that would suggest a stature well over 2.5 meters if scaled as a human. The measurement is disputed. Some osteologists argue for misidentification, large bison or horse bones misinterpreted under poor recording conditions. Others point to anomalies in the marrow cavity and cortical thickness that might indicate a different biology entirely. The competing explanations are predictable and heated. Skeptics point to taphonomic processes and the well-known practice of sensationalizing finds for local fame or tourism. Realists remind us about the region's Pleistocene megafauna, mammoth and bison arvernus, that can look eerily human in fragmentary preservation. Yet some accounts persist that resist a tidy collapse into mammoth or myth. The context of certain bones, careful placement, apparent inclusion of grave goods, suggests ritual human burial. Another thread of explanation entertains biological variance, populations with genetic predispositions to extraordinary height, though this is a slippery slope into speculation without DNA. For all the measurements and heated debate, we still don't know whether these remains were misidentified megafauna, unusually large humans, or evidence of something out of our ordinary taxonomy. Try to imagine standing with that femur in your hands, the cool weight of mystery, and ask, if it were truly human, how would that reshape the story of who lived here? Not all anomalies are bones and stones. Some are artifacts that seem to have traveled far beyond expected trade corridors. On a river bend, archaeologists cataloged beads, metal fragments, and a small piece of worked obsidian whose geochemical signature linked it to a volcanic source over 700 miles away. Teaser: an assemblage at a riverside camp shows trade links that should have been unlikely given the assumed exchange networks of the period. Historical context: the specimen comes from a site with hearths dated to a period when horse-mediated long-distance travel had not yet been introduced, making long-range trade dependent on networks of human carriers, canoes, and occasional seasonal shifts. The scale of exchange indicated by the range of materials, marine shell, obsidian, certain copper items, paints a portrait of a landscape far more interconnected than simple isolationist models imply. Theories about these items revolve around the intensity of pre-contact trade networks. One model, well supported by isotope studies in other regions, posits a hub-and-spoke pattern where certain central places concentrated goods that then diffused outward. Another argues for episodic long-distance movement, charismatic leaders or ritual specialists who traveled far and returned with only a sprinkling of exotic items, not a steady stream. Skeptics warn of modern contamination. A farmer's heirloom could be recent, misattributed to a deeper stratum by accident. Still, for all the geochemical sourcing and isotope ratios, we still don't know whether these artifacts signal a permanent, deep-time trade system or a more ephemeral glittering of exchange. Picture yourself standing at that river bend with a small cache of traded beads, imagining the hands that bartered and the paths that connected distant places. What social forces made such networks possible? Finally, in this opening sweep is a landscape of rumor and late-night talk, a valley where lightning seems to strike stones in patterns and where, according to long-standing local lore, certain nights make the ring of willows whisper in voices that sound eerily like human speech. The teaser, a valley known to ranchers as the place where stones ring without touch, retains a folklore that resists comfortable explanation. Historical context here is scant in archaeological terms but rich in human testimony. Ranch records, local newspapers from the early 20th century, and ethnographic notes from neighboring tribes sketch a culture of caution around the valley. People avoid camping certain nights, elders refuse to cut willows in the ring, and there are more animals skittish than one would expect. Explanations range from geological, pockets of piezoelectric minerals reacting to temperature shifts, to acoustic phenomena where the topography amplifies distant sounds in unnatural ways. Folklorists, however, remind us to take stories seriously as cultural data. Whether or not stones literally ring, the fact that people tell this story generates behavior, ritual, and a cautionary ethic woven into land use. Paranormal enthusiasts will, predictably, opt for the supernatural, residual energy, ancient curses, or thin places where the veil between times wears thin. For all acoustic measurements and mineral surveys, we still don't know whether the valley's mystery is physical, cultural, or both. Close your eyes and picture the willows lining a dark creek, your breath fogging, hearing a distant, human-like cadence carried on the air. Do you chalk it up to wind, or do you let the story hold a place of possibility? If you are already bristling at the unreliability of rumor or eager for a neat, science-backed account, that is the right instinct. Skepticism is how we avoid being fooled. But skepticism and wonder are not enemies, they are partners. In every one of these scenes, empirical data exists: charred seeds dated in a lab, trace element analysis of obsidian, soil stratigraphy that tells stories in a language only partially decoded, and in every case, the evidence opens doors rather than closing them. That is what makes these Montana mysteries infectious. They refuse to settle into tidy answers and instead demand a willingness to sit in uncertainty, to hold multiple possibilities, and to imagine how the lives of ancient people might have been richer and more complicated than we usually assume. So let us go forward with both our notebooks and our imaginations open. We will take each site seriously, lay out the measurements, the competing theories, and the mythic threads, and then we will step back into the larger frame. What does it mean, for us now, that certain things in this land are not yet explained? Why do these mysteries matter beyond curiosity? And why, even as we demand better data and more careful excavation, should we not discount the stories the land has kept for generations? In the next section we will dive deeper into each major site, its measurements, its debates, the testimonials that make it human, and we will keep circling the core question: how do these anomalies change our story of human life on these plains? The plateau's ring of stones refuses to relinquish its quiet arrogance. When you walk among them in the low light of morning, the granite faces are not only rough and weathered but intimate. You can imagine generations of hands, calloused, careful, tracing the same grooves, repositioning the same stones, marking the same alignments. Excavators working nearby have described the soil as layered like a palimpsest, a living surface of recent roots and prairie grasses. Beneath that, a compacted occupation layer dotted with charcoal flecks and flakes of broken tools. Beneath that, sterile subsoil. Radiocarbon samples from the charcoal point to multiple episodes of activity, some clustering in the late Holocene, others hinting at earlier pulses of human presence. This layered sequence is crucial because it tells a story not of a single moment but of repetition, people returning to this place across centuries, possibly across millennia, to perform acts whose meaning may have shifted while the physical practice persisted. The pattern of the stones, measured by careful surveyors, shows not only a near-circular plan but also subtle deviations, a pair of larger stones set slightly off-center, a gap where one would expect symmetry, and when the sun hits on the solstice, a thin line of light that seems to bisect the arrangement in a way that makes some researchers bristle with excitement and others sigh with caution. The presence of obsidian flakes whose geochemistry matches sources far to the west suggests movement, people or goods crossing ranges that, in our imagination, are formidable. One plausible interpretation is social. This was a gathering place, a long-term node in a network of seasonal movement where knowledge and ritual were renewed. Another interpretation, less conservative and more seductive, insists the layout encodes a cosmology, a map of the heavens embodied on Earth, and that the off-center stones are markers for an epical astronomical event we no longer fully recognize. Both could be true, both could be partial. Walk the perimeter and feel the wind as it threads the stones. You will sense, whether on intuition or on the hard-taught pattern recognition of an archaeologist, that the ring was meant to be encountered in a sequence, to be approached and understood as a choreography rather than as a single monument. The canyon petroglyphs are quieter in some ways and louder in others. Their voices are stubborn, imperfect, immediate. These are not tidy images preserved in a museum. They are breathing traces on living rock, darkened by patina and lichen and the slow, patient hands of centuries. You will stand under those overhangs and see the conversation between figures, bison in mid-throng, hunters with bows that seem too small for their intended prey, and those elongated figures that pull at the edges of plausibility. Scholars trained in iconographic analysis will caution you, stylization is not evidence of extraordinary biology. Dress can stretch the silhouette, ritual regalia can make a person look otherworldly, and symbolic elongation can emphasize status or spiritual potency rather than literal height. Yet even with that methodological patience, interpretations diverge. Some ethnographers point to oral traditions of tall people, giant ancestral figures who feature in origin stories across multiple groups, not as evidence of physical giants roaming the plains but as metaphoric giants, ancestors of larger-than-life deeds. Others, driven by a literalist impulse, will point to burial accounts and fragmentary osteology reported in ranch diaries and say that perhaps there was once a biological reality commensurate with the iconography. Neither side can prove the other wrong without more data, and the data are stubbornly elusive. Rock faces do not yield DNA. What they do offer is context. The petroglyph panels are often situated near springs and seasonal fords, places of gathering and exchange, which makes symbolic explanations attractive. Still, picture yourself running your hand along the pecked grooves, feeling the rock's coolness, imagining the makers, adults with soot-blackened hair, children playing beneath the same overhang, elders pointing and telling the same stories. The figure's elongated form, then, becomes a hinge between the literal and the metaphorical, and our work is to hold both possibilities with rigor and imagination. The earthworks beneath the prairie are, when you first glimpse them from the air, like scripts half erased by time. Their rectilinear outlines suggest planning on a scale that, if meant for permanent settlement, demands reconsideration of how sedentary life could have developed on these plains. Test pits reveal compacted floors, post molds spaced with regularity suggesting buildings with durable foundations, and hearths whose soot tells of repeated domestic use. Small finds, bone beads, worked shell, cluster in places that feel like domestic loci, cooking, weaving, childcare. Yet the absence of large-scale storage features complicates a simple household model. Where, for example, are the granaries that would sustain year-round populations? One argument suggests that these were seasonal aggregation centers, thus intensive use without the need for permanent, year-round storage. Another posits an agricultural practice adapted to the plains' volatility, small-scale cultivation combined with bison hunting, an economy of resilience that leaves less in the way of monumental storage but much in the way of social complexity. There is also the possibility of multifunctional landscapes, places that served as market, theater, and cemetery depending on the season. As you kneel in the test trench, counting the rings in a carbon fragment as if they were a clock, you begin to sense how our categories, settled versus mobile, ritual versus domestic, may be too blunt to parse the reality of these human lives. Bones have a way of collapsing abstractions into something immediate and heavy. The ranch femur photographed in the 1930s is not merely a sensational object. It is a weight in the hands of history and rumor. Accounts vary. Some remember a farmer's boast, others a hush, and a photograph in a county archive that shows a limb so large it required 2 men to pose it for scale. Skeptics are right to remind us of misidentification. Bison can leave misleading fragments, and the context of discovery, plowing, disturbance, and amateur retrieval complicates any straightforward conclusion. But beyond the taphonomic possibilities lies the social question. Why do communities persist in telling extraordinary versions of the same find? The answer often circles back to meaning. A large bone becomes not merely a bone but a symbol of antiquity's depth, of the land's strangeness, of one's own smallness in the sweep of time. Scientists who have had access to curated fragments in small museums have run tests, stable isotopes, histology of bone cortical thickness, and sometimes found nothing to support mythic claims. Other times, results are ambiguous. Morphology suggests large-bodied animals, but minor features could be interpreted either as natural variation or as something more unusual. Here the scientist and the storyteller meet and imperfectly collaborate. The scientist brings measurement and method. The storyteller brings motive and meaning. Both are necessary for understanding why the bones matter beyond their osteological identity. The river assemblage, beads and metals and obsidian, presses on our models of exchange like an insistent thumb. A tiny fragment of obsidian resolved to a specific volcanic source tells a long-distance story that would have required multiple hands and stops over hundreds of miles. The trade in shell, copper, and stone suggests interlocking networks of exchange that knit disparate landscapes together. Anthropologists have a term: down-the-line trade, for the way goods travel through many hands, each hop shortening the original social distance but lengthening the chain. This model fits some of what we see here: items with wear consistent with prolonged use, repairs that speak to value retained across hands and generations, and contextual evidence of feasting and gift-giving events where exotic items functioned as social glue. Yet optical mineralogy and geochemical sourcing sometimes reveal concentrations of non-local items that are too dense for mere casual diffusion. That invites more complex explanations: centers of charismatic power where ritual warranted mobilizing large consignments of goods, or episodes of intensified exchange tied to climatic fluctuation that force people into more cooperative networks. Imagine standing on the river bank where these items were left, the water a ribbon moving toward places you cannot see, and think about the social lives of those objects, the hands that polished them, the negotiations that traded them, the meanings assigned to their glint in evening fires. The valley where stones ring and willows whisper is an object lesson in the power of landscape to generate story. Acoustic scientists bring instruments, geophones, frequency analyzers, and measure the valley's resonance, its capacity to carry and sometimes amplify frequencies in ways human ears interpret as uncanny. Geologists map the bedrock and find traces of minerals that, when stressed, can produce electromagnetic anomalies. Anthropologists sit with ranchers and record the rituals that have accreted: an avoidance of certain nights, a tradition of leaving offerings at a particular juncture of the creek, an elder's stern refusal to uproot a willow. This is where interdisciplinary humility matters. The physical sciences offer testable hypotheses, and the humanities insist we treat lived belief as data. Both together produce a fuller account than either could alone. Whether the valley's phenomena are strictly explainable by physics or partly constituted by human attention, the way ritual focus composes experience matters less than the fact that the valley exerts an ethical gravity on local people. Stand in the willow ring at dusk and you will feel it pull at you. The story is alive because it shapes behavior. Across all these scenes, the temptation is to pick one narrative and force the rest to fit: giants, ancient voyagers, or sophisticated indigenous astronomers. But the evidence resists monism. We are left, gloriously and frustratingly, with a set of partial truths, material traces that lean one way but never resolve, stories that preserve memory with the elasticity of myth, and landscapes that hold both human technique and human imagination. The obligation of the storyteller, and of the scientist, is to present this mess with clarity and care, to give you the dates and methods without flattening the wonder, and to give the wonder without abandoning the discipline of evidence. So let us imagine again, because imagining is not the opposite of rigor but a mode of inquiry in itself. Picture yourself arranging stones on that plateau in a manner that marks not only the calendar but the passage of kin, announcing births and deaths and marriages in a built language that endures after individual names fade. Picture a rock artist perched in a canyon, chipping symbols that will outlast his great-grandchildren, encoding warnings and maps and mythic giants in the same gesture. Picture the makers of earthworks building dynamic, seasonal places for a community that moved to the rhythm of animal migrations and the pulse of river floodplain fertility. Picture a traveler, with an obsidian blade hung at his waist, paddling or walking to trade at a spring where people gather to feast and to perform a rite that strengthens the social ties necessary for survival. Picture a valley that hums at night with the chorus of memory, where people behave according to a story until the story becomes physical, a ritual ecology. Each picture is not proof, Each is a plausible life world that helps explain why the traces we find are shaped the way they are. Still, for all the evocative imagining, the stubborn scientific questions remain. How old are certain motifs exactly? When did certain trade routes crystallize into regular patterns? And what biological story can explain anomalously large bones? The work to answer these questions is ongoing and often painstaking. It requires permission from landowners, collaboration with descendant communities, careful excavation and sampling, and the slow accumulation of data that, in aggregate, can tip an interpretation from possible to persuasive. Importantly, the people who live here now, ranchers, tribal members, townsfolk, are not mere spectators to the past. They are interlocutors in the present. Their memories, their archived photographs, and their rituals are primary data as much as charcoal or obsidian. When a tribal elder recounts a story of a place being taboo for reasons that align with an archaeological anomaly, that alignment is not coincidence. It is evidence of cultural continuity that may span centuries. Scientific humility demands we take those voices seriously, not as quaint extras but as necessary collaborators in reconstructing past lifeways. We are not, in other words, chasing myths for the thrill of the chase. We are engaging with living places where past and present braid together. By holding competing explanations side by side, by admitting that trade and pilgrimage, cosmology and calendar, biology and folklore may all be part of the story, we allow a more honest representation of the past. And we keep the possibility open that someone, perhaps even you, listening now, might be the one to ask the question in just the right way, to propose a test that once run will narrow the field of plausible explanations. Until then, these places will hold their questions like seeds, and our duty is to keep them from drying out, to preserve the sites, to record the stories, and to continue digging, scientifically, ethically, and imaginatively, so that the next generation has a richer set of data to work with. There are corridors of frustration in this work, too. Funding cycles do not align with the slow rhythms of soil formation, and sensational claims, giants, curses, lost civilizations, attract attention and money in ways that careful incremental science does not. This mismatch sometimes encourages sloppy claims and incentivizes spectacle over rigor. Yet the remedy is not to retreat into sterile caution but to insist on better standards, reproducible sampling, open collaboration with tribal nations and local communities, transparent publication of methods, and a cultural commitment to resisting the seductive clarity of simple stories when the evidence is ambiguous. The public deserves stories that are both thrilling and true, which is to say stories that do not flatten nuance for the sake of a viral headline. We can be cinematic and exacting. The two are not opposites. Indeed, some of the most powerful narratives arise precisely from the tension between what we hope to know and what stubbornly resists our instruments. As we move from site to site, one theme keeps returning: connectivity. Whether it's stones aligned to the sun, petroglyphs echoing ancestral memory, earthworks suggesting planned gatherings, bones that test our assumptions, or traded objects tracing invisible highways, the land is not a set of isolated points but a network. The implications are profound. If Montana's past was stitched into wider webs of exchange, belief, and movement, then our national history, too often told as a sequence of isolated frontier encounters, must be redrawn as a palimpsest of overlapping networks that predate and prefigure the modern nation. This reframing honors the agency of the people who lived here long before colonization and acknowledges the complexity of the social fabrics they wove. It also humbles us. The past was not a simpler time. It was different, complicated by its own forms of technology, mobility, and imagination. So when you stand once more on that ridge where the air is blunt and the sky brutally wide, remember that the tidy map in your mind is only one reading. Beneath the grass, beneath the crust of routine, the land keeps other scripts. Our job is to read them with care, to listen to the people who still live in those scripts, and to hold our certainty lightly. The mysteries of Montana are not mere puzzles to be solved by the next dig or the next sensational headline. They are invitations to a longer, deeper conversation about how humans make meaning in place. Keep your hand on the stone, your ears tuned to the canyon, your eyes on the river, and your skepticism sharpened but hospitable. There is much more to say about each of these sites: the stratigraphy of the plateau, the microscopic wear patterns on the obsidian, the oral histories archived in town halls, and we will continue to trace those lines. For now, imagine the scene: the sun lowering, the stones lengthening their shadows, and the land keeping its slow counsel. The next place we walk to is a valley tucked where the mountains fold into themselves, a place people call in half-joking awe the sink of voices, because sound behaves there like a liquid. Pull it tight and it will spill. Here, the ground is laced with terraces, small and shallow, as if someone once tried to plow the sky into beds. From a distance the terraces look like the lines on a giant's palm. Up close you find cross-cutting features: fire-cracked rock, lenses of charcoal, scatterings of hammered stone, that announce repeated human occupation. Radiocarbon samples taken from charred seeds in these lenses give calibrated ranges clustering around the late Holocene, roughly within the last 2,000 years. But there are also older contexts, deeper lenses of carbon and bone that hint at intermittent use stretching back much further. Measurements of the terraces show a recurring module, surfaces averaging 4 meters across with drainage features that speak to a cleverness in site engineering, people who knew how to tame seasonal water, to coax fertility out of thin soil. We must be careful here to separate what the evidence shows from what we hope it shows. The terraces are not a field of neatly spaced corn cribs. They are irregular, patched, and adapted, and that irregularity suggests a people responsive to microclimates and animal movement rather than rigid, monocultural agriculture. Key finds in the valley include a small cache of ground stone tools, a scattering of bone awls, and a concentration of charred elderberry pits that indicate local plant processing. More surprising are a handful of copper beads, heavily patinated, whose composition suggests native copper sources from great distances. The presence of copper invites questions, not only about trade but about symbolic practice, as copper in many native contexts carries spiritual weight beyond its utilitarian use. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Were these terraces primarily seasonal camps for intensive plant processing and social exchange, or are they the residual imprint of a more permanent, redistributed foodscape where wild and managed resources interleaved? One theory, drawing on pollen cores and soil micromorphology, argues for intentional plant management, rock mulching, selective thinning, and perhaps a proto-horticultural practice that predates classic agricultural packages in the region. Another, more conservative interpretation reads the terraces as adaptive responses to ephemeral microhabitats used intensively during certain seasons. A third, seductive idea suggests the terraces were part of a ritualized landscape, each bed a locus for life cycle events, for teaching and for songs that bound kin together. Still, for all the terraces' geometry and the charred pits' testimony, we still don't know whether these were the living rooms of a settled people or the stage of repeated seasonal return. Picture yourself kneeling in a shallow terrace, the scent of smoke and dried fruit rising, a child's hand brushing your sleeve. You feel the rhythms of a life organized by fire and weather rather than by a single economic model. Further north, where the prairies rise to blunt ridgelines, an isolated set of masonry steps climbs out of a creek bed. They are rough, fieldstone mortared with an earthen-hide adhesive of a kind seldom used in later colonial builds, and they lead to a low chamber whose roof has collapsed but whose floor remains compacted and dark with centuries of foot traffic. The chamber's plan is roughly circular, measuring about 5 meters across, and inside, small post holes along the perimeter suggest a superstructure of poles and skins or woven mats. The artifact assemblage recovered from test excavations is small but rich: a broken concave mirror of polished stone, a cache of small perforated bone pendants, and a handful of ochre-stained flakes. Relative dating through optically stimulated luminescence on the chamber's sediments puts the last significant use episode at several hundred years before European contact, though underlying deposits may be older. What makes this site particularly compelling is the context. The chamber sits at the confluence of 3 game trails and near a spring that, ethnographers insist, was historically a shared neutral zone among neighboring groups. One interpretive thread reads the chamber as a ritual lodge, a place for initiation, healing, or the interchange of sacred knowledge. Another argues for a utilitarian function, a hunting lookout and seasonal shelter. Yet another, more speculative voice wonders about astronomical usage. The concave mirror might have focused light or fire, an instrument of ceremonial illumination. But here, too, the evidence is partial. The mirror's polish could be the residue of careful grinding for practical reasons, and ochre is a material of many social lives, adornment, hide preservation, or ritual anointment. Still, we cannot shake the feeling that the chamber, like the terraces, was a point of convergence, a material distillation of the social ties that bound people across the landscape. Picture yourself opening the collapsed roof and reaching down into the cool dark, fingertips brushing centuries-old grit. The chamber is small enough to hold a single person's breath and large enough to hold a communal secret. There are sites where the earth yields artifacts whose craftsmanship seems to smile at our categories of technology. At a lakeside midden we find worked bone points, not just simple barbed tips but shafts with micro-groove decorations and micro-drilled eyes that would have taken an extraordinary patience to produce. Strandline deposits preserve not only bones and shells but impressions of woven matting, thin, densely packed fibers that survive only because they were charred and sealed under anoxic mud. Radiocarbon dates from the wood charcoal cluster in an era when climatic oscillations were shifting the lake's shoreline, forcing communities to adapt. The sophistication of the bone and fiber work implies a specialized craft production, possibly a guild of artisans whose skills traveled across regions. This opens competing theories. Were these artisan specialists tied to hereditary lineages who maintained complex craft vocabularies? Or were they itinerant craftsmen moving among seasonal camps, teaching and learning in a diffuse network? The presence of standardized forms, consistent point types and recurring textile patterns, leans towards specialization, but specialization implies social structures that support non-subsistence labor, and that in turn invites fresh questions about population density, resource reliability, and social stratification in a region we sometimes imagine as broadly egalitarian. For all the micro-drilled holes and perfectly grooved shafts, we still don't know how craft knowledge was transmitted or what social prestige accrued to the makers. Imagine picking up one of those thin, worked points and feeling the precision of its edges. In that moment you hold, miniature and sharp, the hand of an ancient artisan. Beyond material culture, this land keeps language and story in ways that archaeology alone cannot capture. In plains communities, place names are vessels of layered meaning, geographical descriptors, memory anchors, and moral signposts. An elder in a nearby reservation will point to a high butte and give you a name that translates roughly as, "Where the drum fell silent," and then, with a smile that holds both affection and warning, tell you why no one hunts there anymore. Oral histories collected over decades by tribal archivists speak of forced movements, migrations, and deliberate concealments, people moving to hide caches, elders retiring to secret places to bury sacred objects, whole families altering routes to avoid predation. These narratives sometimes corroborate archaeological anomalies. A place that villagers avoid might correspond spatially to a cluster of unusual artifacts, or a lack of disturbance across an otherwise trodden landscape. Direct invitation: when you listen to these stories, you must not treat them as mere allegory. They are data encoded in human time. Now, let's be fair, oral history is not the same as a stratigraphic column, and memories are shaped by subsequent events and by conscious narrative choices. But neither should we ignore oral testimony because it does not conform to scientific expectations. Stories and soil together make a fuller archive. One of the most provocative and contested sites is a shallow cave tucked high on a limestone escarpment where, in a narrow chamber, someone once painted a vertical sequence of red pigments that drip like a bloodstream down the wall. The pigments are layered, and under microscopic examination they reveal binders consistent with plant gums and blood proteins, materials that speak to ritual use. The verticality of the painting, red strokes descending in a precise cadence, has invited numerous readings. Some see a cosmological map of descent and return. Others read the sequence as a mnemonic device for oral genealogies. Yet another line of thought connects the imagery to shamanic trance practices, with descending lines representing spirit journeys. Accelerator mass spectrometry dates on the binder are consistent with pre-contact times, though contamination and reuse complicate exact figures. Mythic elements swirl here, Local storytellers whisper of nights when the cave's paintings glow faintly, as if the pigments remember the touch of flame. Scientists, understandably, put aside glowing stories and focus on pigment composition and stratigraphy, but the persistence of the glowing story as community lore is itself an anthropological artifact worth studying. Still, for all the binder analyses and microstratigraphy, we still don't know exactly what the sequence meant to the painters or whether the ritual practice continued long after the pigments dried. Picture yourself entering the cave with a low lamp, watching the crimson drip down the stone, and feeling as if you have crossed a threshold not just in space but in time. Trade, ritual, daily life, remembrance, each runs like a thread through these sites, and when threads cross they form patterns that are not easily reducible to a single causal explanation. Consider the landscape as a palimpsest in which different social actors wrote, erased, and rewrote their marks: hunters who mapped game movement in pebble cairns, elders who painted cosmologies on limestone walls, couples who bound the edges of their mats with copper beads from a far river, artisans who tuned stone and bone into precise instruments. The very multiplicity, economic, spiritual, social, makes singular claims brittle. We should therefore resist the simple festivals of explanation. This was the calendar, this was the temple, this was the market. Often, it was all of these, depending on the season, the scale of observation, and the social actors involved. And yet the human desire to fill gaps with coherent narratives is powerful. That is why stories of giants persist in the local imagination. They answer a set of emotional needs. Giants make sense of oversized bones. They dramatize the sense of ancientness that landscapes evoke. They function as metaphors for the scale of ancestral deeds. But there are also pragmatic reasons such tales endure. Tourists pay attention to sensational stories. Local economies sometimes cultivate legends to attract attention, and the very cadence of oral transmission favors the memorable. As scholars, we must both understand the pragmatic economy of myth and guard against letting the economy dictate the narrative of the past. In practical terms, that means rigorous sampling, open datasets, and collaborative work that includes descendant communities as co-authors of the past rather than subjects of study. Still, for all the layers of method and motive, an emotional conclusion keeps rising. These landscapes invite humility. They remind us that stone, bone, and pigment are not inert, they are invitations. When we honor the ambiguity, when we hold measurement and metaphor in tension, we allow the past to speak in a fuller voice. We also preserve the possibility for new discoveries that could, at any time, rearrange our understanding. A single well-placed ash layer, a new geochemical signature, a DNA sample from a curated bone, any of these could shatter a prevailing hypothesis or vindicate a marginalized reading. So let us keep digging, but let us do so with hands that are careful and ears that listen. Imagine yourself at the Lake Midden, the boat's shadow sliding along the water. Imagine the feel of a work-bone tool between your fingers, the tiny striations like fingerprints. In those small marks you will find not just utility but story, the labor of someone who once lived and loved, who made choices that shaped the arcs of their children's days. We still don't know the full script of those lives, but we have enough to honor them, to ask better questions, and to keep the conversation going. The hanging stones cling to a windswept escarpment like an arranged set of teeth, an array of tabular rocks balanced on tiny pedestals of eroded bedrock, each stone turned or scored in ways that suggest intention more than accident. Here's the simplest way to frame it. Along a bluff that throws its shadow over two converging coulees, a line of perched stones appears positioned with a care that argues for human placement rather than pure geology. The historical context is as immediate as the wind. The escarpment overlooks a valley that was a natural corridor between riverine zones and upland hunting grounds, a place where humans would have passed for millennia. Surveyors measured the stones and found the line extends for nearly 90 meters, with individual stones ranging from shoulder height to nearly 2 meters, not small things to balance on eroded pedestals if gravity had not been part of the plan. Lichen growth and surface weathering indicate great age. Microscopic analysis of accreted mineral layers suggests some faces have been exposed for at least several centuries, perhaps far longer. The landscape here funnels sound and view in dramatic ways. A person standing at the stones can see multiple ridges and the light on the river 30 kilometers away, which makes the site strategically and symbolically potent. Key discoveries around the base of the escarpment complicate a purely ornamental reading. Test trenches disclosed a fill layer beneath some pedestals consisting of compacted earth and small cobbles, evidence that someone prepared and stabilized the base rather than leaving it to natural erosional processes. Small caches of worked bone and flake stone were found in shallow pits at irregular intervals, and in one pocket was the partial remains of what might be a bundled offering, ash, fragments of carved shale, and a few charred plant remains that carbon date to a calibrated range centering roughly 800 to 1200 years before present. One especially intriguing find was a narrow groove cut into a face of one stone that aligns with the midwinter sunset when observed from a specific position among the stones, a line of sight that is narrow enough to be accidental only with great improbability. The measurement of that alignment, angling within a degree or two of the solar azimuth, has led to heated discussions among those who study archaeoastronomy and those who caution against overinterpreting alignments that could easily be coincidence in a richly textured landscape. But here's where it gets tricky. Why balance stones on pedestals at all? One functional explanation holds that the stones mark a territorial boundary or signal a travel route, visual markers that remain visible across seasons and floods. Another suggests a lithic language, the sequence of horizontal versus vertical tabular slabs encoding a message readable by those initiated into a local semiotic tradition. A ritual explanation sees the stones as a stage theater for seasonal rites, actors, priests, and audiences arranged along the escarpment to watch sunlight strike the landscape at particular times of year. And then there are less likely but more sensational theories, that the placement marks the path of an archaic procession of unusual people, giants in local lore, whose burials or memorials were commemorated by balancing stones to denote their largesse or their uprightness. Geologists point out that periglacial features and frost jacking can sometimes leave tabular stones perched, and they are right to insist on rigorous sediment analyses and stratigraphic controls. Ethnographers, meanwhile, recall a story told by an elder of a tribe in the region. Once, before the white tents and iron tools, women sang and men danced along a line of stones that kept watch over the valley, and on certain nights the wind would make them speak in low, bell-like tones. Still, for all the pedestals, alignments, and oral lines, we still don't know whether the hanging stones were a road, a message, a stage, or a deeply local ritual architecture of a people whose language and practice we only glimpse. Walk the escarpment at sunset, and you understand why imagination so eagerly supplies answers. The light drinks along the stones, long shadows splice the coulees, and a person standing among them feels theatrically small. Picture yourself arranging a child's small rock into a precarious balance, and how instinct suggests celebration. Picture a line of people placing stones not for permanence but as ephemeral acts, each boulder a moment in a communal conversation. The reflective insight that anchors this scene is that built things are rarely single-purpose. Monuments are calendars, messages, and social glue at once. When a community invests labor into placing a stone so it endures beyond the life of its makers, it is writing a durable sentence into the landscape about identity and memory. The hanging stones, then, are not merely stones but paragraphs, short, stony sentences left for those who come after. From the escarpment we follow a faint trail into a pocket of riverine ash where the ground yields something else entirely. A burial cluster laid into a shallow terrace whose edges are fringed with willow roots. This is the sight that makes osteologists both excited and uncomfortably speculative. The one-sentence frame, a cluster of burials in a river terrace, indicates social differentiation in a population we previously thought broadly egalitarian. The burials themselves display variation. Some were shallow single interments accompanied by utilitarian goods, others were more elaborate, with arranged bedding of woven fibers, copper ornaments smelted to soft gleam, and what appears to be a deliberate placement of animal remains as companions. Measurements across skeletal remains show variance in diet. Stable isotope ratios on bone collagen reveal one set of individuals with a diet heavy in riverine fish and waterfowl, another set richer in bison proteins. That dietary difference correlates unpredictably with grave goods, Some high-status-looking burials show an inland diet, others a riverine signature. The dates cluster in a couple of centuries in the later first millennium C, a period when climatic fluctuations could have reorganized subsistence strategies. The key interpretive problem here is social. Were we seeing an incipient social hierarchy, specialized roles such as ritual specialists, hereditary leaders, or skilled hunters, whose material trappings signaled rank? Or were the differences in burials simply expressions of network ties and trade access? People buried with exotic goods because they had access to certain exchange circuits? One theory, informed by ethnographic parallels elsewhere, posits ritual specialists who controlled the flow of prestige goods and thus became focal points of community identity. Another interpretation points to emergent chiefdom-like structures that pooled resources seasonally, leaders who orchestrated hunts and redistributed meat, an authority that translated into conspicuous burial. A skeptical voice insists we must not project complexity too quickly upon a thin empirical base. Grave goods can reflect personal choice, kin ties, or even opportunistic reuse of objects. Mythic overlay complicates matters. A story persisted into the 20th century about the river chief, a figure who could call fog from the water and who was buried with his favorite headdress of copper plates. The story is alluring but not proof. Still, despite isotopes, bead typologies, and burial contexts, we still don't know exactly what the social ordering of that group looked like day to day. Move a little farther downstream and you come to a field strewn with work stones and the ghostly depressions of what once may have been sweat lodges or ephemeral structures. Here the air smells faintly of crushed sage and dust, and nearby a spring's dampness supports a cluster of wildflowers that local kids pick at summer dusk. The site yields peculiar artifacts, thin copper blades stamped with simple geometric patterns, fragments of woven cordage that preserve not just plant fibers but impressions of a finer textile beneath, and most perplexing, a small carved disc of a dark stone with incised marks that some analysts read as a calendar. The disc measures scarcely 6 centimeters across, yet its grooves suggest a counting system organized into irregular segments. 5, then 8, then 13. Numbers that might map to lunar cycles or ritual counts. The artifact sits within a matrix of hearths whose sealed ash layers give surprisingly precise radiocarbon dates, making the disc a candidate for synchronized ritual practice rather than stray curiosity. Competing theories for the disc and the associated hearths range widely. One holds that the disc was a mnemonic device used by storytellers or shamans to recall genealogies and ritual sequences. Another suggests a counting tool for trading transactions or calendrical regulation across seasons. A third, bolder hypothesis entertains interregional intellectual exchange, ideas about counting and calendrical calculation traveling by social networks as readily as obsidian or beads. Now, let's be fair. The incised marks could be purely decorative or a child's early attempt at inscription. But the context, carefully sealed hearths, repeated use surfaces, and the disc's proximity to a chamber interpreted by some as communal, pushes analysts toward a functional reading. Picture yourself holding that small, cool disc in your palm. It is pocket-sized but heavy with possibilities. The reflective insight here is that small things can carry institutional weight. A counting disk is not merely a tool but a technology of memory, enabling people to coordinate activities across time and space. In the far drylands, beyond the rivers, we encounter a phenomenon that blurs the line between science and story in almost electric ways: anomalous magnetic readings in a compact area beneath a collapsed basalt outcrop. Geophysicists walked the grid and reported microvariations, spikes in magnetic susceptibility that do not match simple geologic expectations. Test trenches revealed concentrations of fired clay, dense with iron oxides, and traces of repeated heating episodes. Within that sinter-like matrix, shards of ceramic with unique temper, crushed shell mixed with a vegetal binder, appear unlike typical wares documented elsewhere in the province. One hypothesis argues for a localized ceramic tradition developed to meet an unusual set of needs: containers fired in repetitive, high-heat kilns for specific processing of minerals or ores. Another theory imagines ritual pyres where heat and magnetic stone were part of a transformational practice, an alchemy of social metamorphosis. Fringe interpretations, predictably, read the magnetic anomalies as evidence of modern interference or suggest, less plausibly, something extraordinary about natural magnetism concentrated by particular rock fabrics. The empirical path forward is clear: more sampling, thermoluminescence dating, phytolith analysis, and comparative studies of regional ceramics. Until those results consolidate, however, we still don't know whether the magnetic patch is the signature of specialized technical activity, focused ritual, or a combination of both. Across these landscapes, the escarpments balance stones, the river terrace burials, the small counting disk, the magnetic anomaly, the pattern repeats, material forms that invite many readings, each plausible in its way and none entirely conclusive on its own. The lesson is methodological and ethical. Methodologically, we must combine tools: geophysics, radiocarbon dating, isotopic studies, microstratigraphy, to let the land speak in multiple languages. Ethically, we must engage with living communities whose memories, names, and practices have inhabited these places for generations. Their voices are not footnotes but essential evidence. Imagine again standing beneath the hanging stones or holding the tiny disk. The experience collapses distances and asks you to accept the past as simultaneously knowable and resistant. We still don't know everything, but in that admission lies our richest work: to keep asking, to keep testing, and to keep listening. We have walked many miles in imagination and in evidence, following a braid of stone, bone, pigment, and story that refuses to be reduced to a single tidy explanation. If you bring your hand to your mouth at this point, partly in the habit of a story listener, partly because the land asks for silence, you are doing the right thing. The raw pieces we have touched, the ringed stones on that plateau, the canyon faces pecked with elongated figures, the hidden earthworks, the oversized femur that became both photograph and myth, the cache of traded obsidian, the valley that sings and willows that whisper, the terraces shaped like palms, the ritual chamber with its polished mirror, the artisan's tiny drill bone points, the painted red drip in a cave, the hanging stones balanced like punctuation on an escarpment, the clustered burials with their dietary signs and copper ornaments, the minute-counting disk. Each of these things is a sentence, a fragment of a sentence, a punctuation mark, or a paragraph in a much longer text written across time. Taken alone, each invites a set of hypotheses. Taken together, they demand an approach that honors complexity. There is a temptation in modern storytelling to simplify, to want a protagonist, an antagonist, a revelation of scale and meaning. But real human pasts are not tidy narratives designed by a single author. They are compositions built over centuries by many hands and many intentions, revised and edited by later generations who carried different needs. Some of the people who shaped those stones did so to mark seasons. Some of the people who deposited beads in rivers did so to seal friendships and obligations that sustained whole families through lean years. Some of the murals in caves recorded journeys of the spirit. Some encoded memory, genealogy, and law. People made choices for reasons we can sometimes measure: dietary shifts in isotopes, the sudden appearance of non-local materials, shifts in hearth positions. But they also made choices for reasons less visible to our instruments: pride, rivalry, humor, revenge, deep grief, and hope. Archaeology and anthropology give us ways to measure and to infer, but they are not exhaustive languages. The virtues of humility and pluralism should govern how we assemble a past in the present. Take connectivity, for instance. When we trace obsidian to a distant source, when copper beads appear in a valley far from their geological cradle, when bead styles propagate, and when motifs in rock art echo across different watersheds, what is revealed is a world intensely social and relational. It is a world of pathways, not simply of isolated homesteads. It suggests that people were knit into circuits of exchange and meaning that crossed modern boundaries. That does not mean an ancient globalized marketplace in our contemporary sense, but it does mean ideas, objects, and people moved sufficiently to create durable patterns. Those patterns, trade networks, pilgrimage routes, ritual centers, become the scaffolding around which lives were organized. When we choose to see the land as a network, the strange things we find stop being anomalies at the edges and become nodes in a fabric we can begin to describe. Equally important is the persistent presence of story. Oral histories, the whispered warnings about a valley's willows, the tale of a river chief, the admonition that a certain butte is where the drum fell silent. These are not mere folklore to be filed away as quaint extras. They are ways of encoding memory across generations, habitually practiced because they serve social ends, marking danger, naming ancestral obligations, conserving places of scarce resources, or asserting moral claims. When an elder tells us not to camp here, and the ground beneath such a place holds an undisturbed archaeological deposit, the convergence of narrative and study becomes more than coincidence. It becomes a cross-cultural signal that something important is being guarded. That is why respectful collaboration with descendant communities is not optional. It is necessary for both ethical and empirical reasons. Local knowledge often points us to places our satellite imagery misses. Tribal stories sometimes contain, in stripped and coded forms, clues to past events. To ignore them is to ignore a vital archive written in human memory. We must also address the seduction of extremes, the easy lure of giants and curses, of lost civilizations staged like melodramatic reveals. Sensationalism thrives because it is shortcut storytelling. It promises a clear end that satisfies a hunger for certainty. Responsible inquiry resists that hunger without extinguishing wonder. The difference between sensationalism and wonder is the presence of method, wonder kept honest by testable hypotheses, by repeatable sampling, by transparent publication of data, and by the willingness to correct course when new evidence undermines prior conclusions. The excavation that yields an unexpected femur must be accompanied by careful osteology, isotopic testing, DNA analysis where possible, and proper curation. The panel of petroglyphs that look like giants must be read alongside ethnography, comparative iconography, and a sober assessment of stylistic conventions. Wonder and rigor together produce the truest thrills, the ones that can be shared across years and years because they survive the kind of scrutiny that filters out error. Practically, the path forward involves a 10,000-step humility. It means more collaborative projects, academic archaeologists working shoulder to shoulder with tribal archaeologists and local historians. It means open databases so others can test your assertions. It means cross-disciplinary methods, geophysics, luminescence dating, microbotanical analysis, ancient DNA, and careful stratigraphy rather than single-dimension claims. It means conservation, too, protecting fragile petroglyph panels from weathering and vandalism, controlling access to sensitive burial sites, and ensuring that any artifacts taken into labs have clear provenance and consent. It also means resisting the market pressures that reward flashy discoveries by investing in long seasons of careful, sometimes tedious work. The past does not yield its authority to the loudest voice, it yields to the patient. Yet for all the methodological admonitions, we must not lose the human strand at the heart of these studies. When you hold a drilled bone point, you feel not only the sharpness of technology but the precision of a life shaped by hands. When you trace the grooves of a petroglyph with gloved fingertips, you touch an intention that sought to be seen by others. When you stand among stones that were balanced and stabilized generations ago, you feel the cumulative social labor that made the line persist. These are not relics to be conquered, they are conversations with human beings whose choices echo into our present. The ethical imperative is to treat their traces with respect, to ask permission before probing, to listen before theorizing, to share findings in ways that build mutual trust rather than extract stories for spectacle. There will be moments, perhaps soon, perhaps decades hence, when a single test will shift the story in a surprising direction. A DNA result might reveal unexpected connections, a carefully dated ash layer might anchor a sequence of activity. A comprehensive survey might reveal that what look like isolated points are nodes of a much larger system. But such breakthroughs are cumulative, not theatrical. They arrive because a community of practice persisted in careful methods, and because those practices included voices that had long guarded the landscape's knowledge. If you are moved by mystery, support that patient work. If you are curious, lean into the records, the published methods, and the dialogues with descendant partners. If you are a storyteller, tell what is known and what remains open with equal respect. In the end, why do these mysteries matter? They matter because they lengthen our sense of belonging. They teach us that the land is not a blank stage upon which our modern dramas unfold. It is a palimpsest of other lives that we inherit, steward, and sometimes disturb. Knowing more about those lives enlarges our ethical imagination. It asks us to be caretakers of a continuity we did not begin and will not finish, and that moral stance reshapes how we live now. The mysteries themselves, whether resolved as calendar stones, craft hubs, exchanged goods, ritual ecologies, or a mix of all, give us perspective. They teach patience, an appreciation for diverse forms of intelligence, and a humility about how little a single generation can claim to know. So stand once more on that ridge. Look out at the low horizon where prairie dissolves into sky. Hear, if you can, the small creak of a willow in a distant valley, the faint scrape of a stone sloughed by time, the imagined tapping of an artisan's drill into bone. Let skepticism be your tool, not your shroud. Let wonder be your guide, but let it be tested by method. Treat stories as clues, and treat artifacts as interlocutors. Keep records, keep agreements, and keep your hands careful. These places, these stones and chambers, middens and murals, are not puzzles meant only for solution, they are invitations to conversation across time. And if you walk out into the evening and feel the urge to promise certainty, resist it. The greatest gift we can give these places is a posture of sustained curiosity, disciplined research, and human respect. Keep your eyes open for the subtle signs, a microstratigraphic lens, a bead whose geochemistry threads to a distant river, an oral story that matches a test pit's undisturbed soil. Support those who work patiently in the layers. Teach the next generation that the past is not conquered but listened to. Share the knowledge you gain with the communities who have long been its guardians. We started on a ridge with an expectation and ended with a larger one, that mysteries do not merely frustrate, they invite. They ask us to be better listeners, more careful scientists, and more generous storytellers. They remind us the world is deeper and stranger than our first maps suggest. So when you pass by a ring of stones, when you hear a canyon's whispered shapes, when you notice a field's strange crop mark from a plane or a satellite, remember that someone else has already walked there, that someone else has already named it, and that the best thing you can do is to add your careful observation to the continuing conversation. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.